Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of The Democratic View. I'm the hostess. My name is Phyllis Italiano. And today I have with me a man who's going to tell us a great deal about a topic and a subject that we all are very involved in thinking about right now. And his name is Bob DeLuca, and he's the president of the Group of the East End. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks for having me.
So, first of all, I always like to start with, tell me who you are, where you were born and raised, and what school you went to, and how did you get interested in this?
Sounds like a police interrogation. I better be careful. Well, let's see. I grew up in Western Connecticut, so I grew up about 100 miles, 80 miles north of New York City. Most of my childhood was in the town of Newtown and Bethel. And,
Newtown?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
As in Newtown, Sandy Hook, Newtown, yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Played baseball on that ball field down there. But, yeah, interesting, right? But where I lived was an area, in a lot of ways like this area. It was rural. I had the opportunity to, bale hay on a farm and spent a lot of time in the woods behind my parents' house. That experience really just got me interested. Behind my mom is still there. My father converted a barn into a house. We lived in this thing. My mom still lives there, and there's about, 200 to 500 acres of stream corridor behind that house. And as a kid, I just spent all my time in there. So me, my dog, I would, flop around in the stream with my snorkel and, look for stuff. That experience just kind of got me to, we weren't a family that was doing hiking or camping, but that's what I did every day when I got home from school. I just kind of humped around out in the woods, looked at stuff. My mother, fortunately, was a reference librarian, so she was always bringing home books about fish and birds and stuff like this. And I think those two things probably conspired to get me really interested in how the world works and how physical systems work and how biology works. Because you saw, there were turtles and crayfish and all that stuff.
Sure.
So that, that's kind of how I get into all this. And then I didn't really know that environmental protection or environmental advocacy existed as a profession. So I started out studying biology. I went to Fordham. And the reason I went to Fordham, which, there are probably better ways to pick a college, but it was across the street from the Bronx Zoo and the Botanical Gardens. And knowing nothing else and the fact that it had nice, cool old buildings, I was like, all right, I'll go here. Which, when I see what goes into picking a college today, I probably should have done a little more research. But anyway, it was a good place to go to school.
Well, it's a good school.
So, I managed to work the Bronx Zoo while I was there. I spent time in the mammal department there. As I got through my coursework, I found that I started to get sort of more tuned into the idea of conservation advocacy and, understanding biology for the purpose of protecting nature as opposed to just looking at it under a microscope. But they didn't, back in those days, have an environmental science curriculum. So in sort of divine intervention, I worked in the registrar's office as a work study student, and I found that you could create your own major if you got various faculty members kind of lined up and you articulated why you wanted to do this. And so I created an environmental science major at Fordham. So that I could find my way into more classes that dealt with public policy and that dealt with the sociology of how we view the environment, which were all out there. But if you took a standard biology major, that wasn't part of your curriculum. So I got very lucky. I happened to be in the right place at the right time. And then...
And you were creative.
And, right. And then through that process, I found out that the State University had a College of Environmental Science and Forestry at Syracuse, which I never would have known about otherwise, but one of my faculty advisors knew something about that, and he was kind of like, hey, you might be interested in this. And so I ended up doing my graduate work up at Syracuse. And at Syracuse, I met Carl Grossman. So Carl Grossman was a guest speaker at the, I was a TA, and Carl Grossman was a guest speaker. My faculty supervisor was in India doing something, and so I picked up Carl at the airport and brought him. We started talking. And when I graduated, my then girlfriend, now wife, was working on Long Island, and I said, geez, I'd like to see if there's something around where she is that I could do this. And Carl Grossman said, why don't you try then Group for the South Fork? Why don't you see if they're looking for anybody? So 1985, I throw my resume in. It just so happens they're looking for somebody. I end up here. I get the job. It's my first job. And I was with the group for a while, and then I went to Suffolk County for about 8 or 9 years in the Office of Ecology, and then I came back in 1992, and I've been here ever since.
Wow.
So
I didn't think I was going to get that.
There you
First of all, your childhood sounds absolutely idyllic.
it was a lot of great stuff.
Oh, boy, were you lucky.
I was just up there this weekend, and, and now my kids, in fact, one of the trees that I hung out in as a kid, which is this great old Norway spruce, which I don't know how it ended up in the middle of this elm red maple swamp, but it's there. And I climbed it and hung out there as a kid. My daughter, my son, they're up there. It was just kind of cool to see that. And it's the kind of place that people drove by and were like, ick, it's a swamp, and there was like a landfill up the road from it. But if you spent time in there, the life was everywhere, under the rocks and in the water. And, there's barred owls in there, there's great horned owls in there, there's herons and all sorts of things. And I think I was like in 7th grade, and I did like this whole biological inventory of everything that I thought was out there. It was not so well done, but I tried given what I had to work with. So yeah, it was great, and it was huge. I mean, it was huge. My whole life really, I think, articulated around that experience. And to this minute, when I drag my kids out on the weekend and I want to go hump around in the woods, it's probably because of that.
That's amazing, amazing. And it's amazing that weren't you lucky to have met Carl?
Right? He just happened to be there, and I just happened to be finishing up. And
such an advocate for the environment.
And he was there at the time speaking about the whole Shoreham issue, and back then Lilco and all those issues. So I always perceived to have been dragged through life toward this end, as opposed to thinking of it myself, because a number of things lined up like that that I never could have figured out on my own.
I know you don't know this about me, but I'm a Fire Islander. I went to Fire Island for 35 years. Oh, wow. And as a matter of fact, I often speak about, I guess it was the nor'easter of '96, when you walked from Lonelyville to Fair Harbor, and in the shore was house upon house upon house. Matter of fact, I used to have a mirror that my daughter took out of one of those houses. Well, no, but we just, we kept saying, oh my God, all this toxicity going into the ocean of these houses. But, and that is the issue of the day, really, is storms. And whatever we're going to call it, whatever it is, and you just came off the committee that worked on the Montauk, big problem that they have there.
Sure.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think, across the Northeast and really across the eastern seaboard, the frequency of storms has been increasing. The intensity of storms seems to be increasing. We have sea level rise, which we can measure. So we have a confluence of things happening that portend that we better get smarter about how we live along the coast, because the impacts of these storms over time, as I mentioned to you earlier, I just did a program about the after effects of Hurricane Sandy earlier today. And looking a little bit at that storm, 8 million people without power, 300 people, just close to 300 people died in that storm in 7 countries. The $75, $80 billion worth of damage. That was less than a Category 1 storm when it made landfall on the East Coast. So, we have a lot of people sharing the landscape with the shoreline. And, at some point, we talked about this earlier today, the program I was doing, there is not a bottomless pit of money to keep paying to put all of this back in the way that we've done it before. So we have to learn different ways to do things if we are to sustain ourselves along the shoreline, and everyone loves the beach and the ocean. And those resources give life to the economy and all of the different things that, from fishing and tourism and all that. It's all very important, but trying to figure out how do we step back from where we've gotten to is a huge challenge. And I think on the Coastal Committee in East Hampton that I was involved in, I felt a lot of those discussions were really productive and helpful, because this is not an easy thing to fix. And it is very challenging both for property owners, for conservation advocates, for those who hold the public trust in terms of taking care of our beaches, for elected officials who, they're sitting there in office, and on the one hand you have people that are saying, hey, I got a huge problem here. You got to help me. What are you doing? I'm paying my taxes every year. And other people who are saying, well, that's okay, but we also have a public resource here, and that public resource we all benefit from, and is part of the reason why the other property values around here are as high as they are. And so we have this, and we're not alone in this. But I think it was a really interesting experience, and I think that committee, while it had a diverse crowd of people around the table, there were a lot of points of agreement. There's always going to be some sticking points, and when you get down to certain issues, that's where elected officials have to make the call, because that's what they're there for. But I think there were a lot of interesting discussions around that table, and a lot of those discussions among the stakeholders were not what you might imagine. I mean, I think there are some folks that would imagine that it would be a constant sort of hair-pulling match, but it really wasn't. I mean, I think that people who have property and businesses on the shorelines, a lot of them are there because they like the beach, like the rest of us, and they've been now confronted with, storm after storm after storm, and the first thing that we all instinctively do is to try to take care of ourselves and our property, and that's to be understood. So people in my business, are often perceived as not getting that, maybe. We just say, well, we got to protect the beach, and I get that, But what I also get is that, like any untreated chronic illness, if we don't start to take measures now to help manage our way out of this situation, we are going to be seeing more storms like Sandy or Irene, or you pick, and maybe one of them will be a Category 3 storm and not a Category 1 storm, and the mess will be immeasurable. And all of the sort of short-term things that we're doing to try to patch up what we have, that's not going to do it, right? So we really have to sort of, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but we sort of have to sober up about the issue and just say, all right, look, we can't have individual and property after property all sort of trying to figure this out, one piece at a time. We need longer range solutions. We need larger areas to be looked at, so that whatever we do, we start to understand the effects at either end. The village of Southampton right now is in a terrible mess, in my opinion, because they have multiple sort of short-term bulkhead and revetment, another bulkhead, and they all kind of went in, and the various agencies are arguing over who permitted what, and some of these things are god-awful to look at, and other people are now saying, well, I don't have a bulkhead, and what's going to happen to me? And so that's a sort of a microscopic version of what we could have in a much larger way. And you and I were speaking before the show, and I think it was interesting that the town of Southampton, to its credit, after the perfect storm and the nor'easters of that era, which were several successional nor'easters that really beat up Bridgehampton, Watermill, tremendous.
Yes.
Put the brakes on and said, okay, and I have to give the public a lot of credit for this. The public also went in and said, can we get a plan? Can we figure this out? And can we decide how we're going to manage this? And they got an outside consultant who wasn't working for anybody else in the town, and they looked at all of these issues, and they developed sort of a 3-tier program as to like how they were going to try to manage the shoreline. Fast forward a decade later, you have a 7-mile beach replenishment strategy for an area of the shoreline, which is going to be, not hard structures, but sand on the beach managed over time to build up a dune system to essentially recreate the normal shoreline processes that you would have. And we think that probably is the best long-term maintenance management strategy, but it takes a lot of planning and a lot of intestinal fortitude to get there.
And I wanted to mention this article, which was in the Times. Lena, can you get a little look at this? It's a little battered looking right now because I have read it several times. It's about a law that, believe it or not, it was Ronald Reagan who put this into effect. And could you tell us a little bit about this? It says rebuilding the shores, increasing the risks. After all, it was $80 billion for Katrina and $75 billion for Sandy.
Right.
And I don't know how many we have of that available.
Right.
Billions.
And these days it seems like less and less. So
Yes.
if anything, there's not more money lying around. I mean, that article, which I had also seen, spoke to the Federal Coastal Barrier Resources Act, and there was
Yes.
and that federal legislation was an attempt to manage down the development pressure on undeveloped barrier beaches, which are slightly different than headland beaches like we have here, but subject, of course, to the same types of inundation from waves and wind and storms. And what Congress, figured a way to do was, rather than saying, thou shalt never develop in these areas, what they did was they precluded certain federally subsidized protections from encouraging development in these areas. So you could not get federally backed insurance, for example, as a way to deter people from putting at risk not only themselves and their property, but also the public taxpayer, who would essentially, in theory, was underwriting all of those subsidized programs coming from somewhere. So by reducing the availability of insurance in those areas, it caused, at the local level, rethinking in many cases of what would we allow to go there. And we know on Long Island, for example, that a lot of insurance companies have actually pulled back already. Private flood insurance, very hard to come by, and whatever flood insurance remains is frequently associated with the federal flood insurance program. The insurance piece, not often talked about in terms of what a town can do with respect to planning and zoning, but the insurance piece is very important here, because if I know I'm putting at risk X amount of structure at X amount of cost, and if that goes away, I'm going to have to put it back again, you might want to think about that. And that's true with all kinds. So that was a clever way to deal with this issue at the federal level while still allowing home rule and not, getting involved in federal takings or anything like that, to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to not allow the federal government to be using taxpayer subsidy to encourage development in an area where we know that over time that development is more likely than other places to get into trouble. And at the same time, by doing so, we're protecting these barrier resources in their natural condition, which we've learned over time provide a very valuable buffer against waves and wind and storms. And that's something that that our barrier beaches, undisturbed and undeveloped, provide us with. So clever. Obviously in places that are already built, in places that don't have barrier island resources, doesn't really affect them. But the concept, and the article went on to talk about the fact that we ought to start looking at this in terms of how we're doing local planning and things like that. And there was a comment I remember in there about it's sort of like a 3 strikes and you're out kind of policy, which
That's
is,
right.
if you have a house, you got a house. If that house gets knocked down, you put up another one. Okay, and the second or third time around, at some point, in the same way that you might, amortize a pre-existing use, that house cannot go back there anymore. And there was a web broadcast today from the governor's office, which I didn't get all the details of because it was on at the same time I was doing the show. But the governor was talking about the same thing, which is really areas where we really have to think about whether we want to go back and build in these areas, and how can we find an amicable way to get people out of those areas where they're really at risk. And that's something which is very difficult to do. It's very difficult to have that conversation with people, and it's very difficult to do that. But I think, you'd hate to have 2 or 3 more storms to get us to the point where we say, okay, $600 billion, now I get it. We need to start now. And it's going to be, no matter what we do, if we started tomorrow doing this, it's going to take us 20 years to make a dent in what we have to deal with, so it's a good time to start. But we can't give up, and we have to understand at every level that this is a big, big challenge, and it's not easy to fix, and local governments are, sort of ill-prepared for that. I mean, they got plenty of things to do every day, and if somebody says, oh, by the way, could you resolve the entire coastal problem while you're at it? I mean, they're trying to figure out, somebody wants a stop sign on, somebody's dog bit somebody. I mean, they got a lot of things going on, plus running the day-to-day, business of government. So, I think everyone's sympathetic to that, but at some level, the federal government can't really do it. The local planning and zoning, particularly in a state like New York, is strongly a home rule state. A lot of things that happen with planning and zoning happen here at the local level. So we have to find a way to transition these ideas and understandings into local policy and support our elected officials when they are moving in that direction, and also to educate our friends and neighbors about the fact that we're not being mean by telling people we don't want them to get hurt in a storm, and that everybody makes mistakes, I mean, houses end up in places where, I think about Mastic and Shirley and places like that, and some of those people in this last storm, terrible, terrible situation. These people don't have a lot of money. Their houses ended up floating off into the marsh. We have to find a way to help those people, but I don't feel like we're helping them to say, we're just going to put you right back in the same bullseye and cross our fingers that it never rains again. We have to do a little better, and we have to, I think if we understand this issue as a human issue and an issue of human compassion, not just real estate,
Yes.
It's a much easier discussion to have. I do not want a small child to be placed in a home that's in harm's way in the middle of a hurricane or a storm if I could have done something else. If I just say, don't worry about it, I'm just going to put you right back. And then, just kind of hope that it doesn't happen again, hope that you don't get flooded out, and hope that your septic system doesn't bubble up from the ground. What am I doing? I mean, I'm just pretending. So, yeah, it's tough, but I don't want to go the other way. And it's not cheap either. It's not like it's free to put people back where they were, and it's impossible to do something else. You have to get creative about it, but it's not a good idea to keep placing people in harm's way if you can avoid it. And that costs everybody, including lives, and it costs money, and all of that should be part of the discussion. And we also know that, we do have businesses and things that are on the beach and do well, and we have to figure out, how do we manage that? This discussion came up a lot in the Montauk discussion with the erosion control issues there. I think you'll hear most of the motel owners saying, look, we don't benefit if there's no beach. We'd like a beach.
Of course. That's the name of this place, beach.
They can understand that, and they do. At the same time, they're saying, but I got a building that's getting, this ocean is getting closer and closer, and what do I do about that? That's not an easy discussion to have. What do you do about that? And how do you do it in a way that doesn't subordinate the beach to the foundation of the building, but at the same, you know what I mean? So these are really, really tough issues. And I guess my feeling is, and I have to tell you, I mean, this coastal erosion issue has been an issue out here since I arrived in 1985, and I'm sure it was for 20 years before that. It's not like
Storm of 38, which I know leveled Fire Island.
Right. And actually, if you see in Montauk too, right? I mean, some of these places. Somebody had a picture during our discussions in East Hampton. Fascinating picture. And I thought it was probably taken like in 1945 or something, but somebody told me it was actually taken in the mid to late 60s. And much of downtown Montauk, as we see it today, really still had not grown back from the 38 hurricane because it had been, really so devastated.
Yes.
Now, will we get another storm of that magnitude? Probably. How do we think about what the place is going to look like afterwards? And one of the things that I've been interested in, and there are some communities that are working on this in the Carolinas and elsewhere, it's called post-storm recovery planning. The idea basically is when an area is subjected to a certain level of damage, so Category 3 hurricane decides to plow through East Hampton, the rules of zoning and rebuilding change. And this is sort of like the 3 strikes and you're out, but we have to do it. We're going to have to do it differently. We're going to have to reconfigure what goes where. We probably are not. It doesn't make a lot of sense to just keep going. Well, okay, just put it all back, and we'll have the same debate for the next 15 years until it gets knocked down again. We're going to have to find another way. So I think there's hope there. In Nags Head in North Carolina, they have a local code there, and essentially for 30 days after a major storm, they don't issue building permits. And that may sound callous, but what it does is it allows everyone to breathe and step back and figure out, okay, before we just say everybody can put back whatever they could put back and make it look like it did before, there's some thinking time there to figure out. And maybe you do let some things go back, but you take a breather and you don't just react in the moment. And that's worth looking at. I know there was a meeting earlier this week with the state of New York, and the state of New York issued kind of a broad permit after Sandy that told people, you can kind of put back in place the things that you had with a general permit. And now they're finding like 50% of those allowed sort of automatic permits have got problems. Too big, too much, more, whatever. So maybe it wasn't the best thing to do.
I thought the state was going to do some buyouts of properties that were in
I
some of
believe
those.
that they are still interested in that. I think they're trying to figure out how do you do it and where do you pick, and I believe that those are going to be voluntary, so people who want to get out of certain areas will be able to go to the state. In fact, in our erosion committee, that issue came up as well, which is can people be bought out of hazardous areas here in the town through the CPF and put those lands into some protected status. And we all thought, yeah, that would make sense. If somebody did not want to be there anymore and that piece of property can go back into protection, well,
I know some woman in Lindenhurst who had a dog, so she wouldn't leave because there was no place to go with her dog. And she and her husband did go, and the water came in like a fire hose was just coming in. And when she was in the attic, she was calling her sons to say goodbye.
Oh boy.
I'm going to die. Fortunately, it stopped.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if that woman went back, but I don't think I would.
It's very, some people are in very tough situations, and then where do they go? And if they don't, the other thing, you might have seen the story in Newsday shortly after the storm, something like 50% of the people who had been really damaged by the storm did not have any kind of flood insurance, and maybe didn't even know it because they said, oh, I got homeowner's insurance or renter's insurance or what have you. And those policies say, it's flooding, sorry. That's devastating for people because, it's like my homeowner's policy. I don't think about it that much, but if I.
I think I have it.
Right.
I have no idea what's in it.
But, if something came in, like my entire house went away, and I called up and I said, geez, I'm paying it. And they said, oh, sorry.
Most people in this storm just lost power. I lost everything that was electrical in my house. I was surged by LIPA.
Oh, so
which is why I am so interested in this storm, because I know
Yeah.
I really felt some of the effects that other people did not feel, except the loss of power, which is basically, you live through it.
Yeah.
But this is a very difficult reality that we have in front of us. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions of the things that people can do for not only preparing for the next big one, which is only a matter of time before it happens, but also what we can do to help the environment.
Well, with respect to sort of coastal flooding and storms, I mean, a few things that are, if you are in a low-lying area, you need to know that, and a lot of people don't, and there's no disrespect in that, but you buy a house, you don't know, and you need to find that out, because that could be very important, one, for the insurance that you might need or have available to you. The other thing is that if you are rebuilding or you're doing additions or something, that construction should be built in a way which is what we call flood-proofed or FEMA-tized. One of the things that they found in this storm is that buildings that came back, that had been built or rebuilt just a little higher, because they basically were, they were within the FEMA flood zone, and so the first floor elevation might have been up a few feet or what have you. They did much better for obvious reasons, because there was a calculation there that said the flooding is more than likely to come to here, and if your first floor is here. So people should think about that. It might not be something which is automatically mandated, but you need to think about that in terms of construction and reconstruction. In any sort of shallow coastal low-lying area, the town of East Hampton has this harbor protection overlay district, but the goals of that are to try to minimize the straight running of water into surface waters. If you can put a buffer between your lawn and any surface water, a buffer of natural vegetation, unmowed vegetation, someplace where the water can filter in, very good idea. You probably need to understand where your septic system is and whether that septic system is functioning. And to the extent that you have an older system, that system is looked at by a professional who can tell you if it's working, who can pull the solids out of that system and help to get some of the bacteria and viral loads. Because the other thing, which we don't talk about so much, but when we have a storm surge on top, we see it coming. There's also a surge in the groundwater. In other words, the groundwater moves around too.
Yes.
In the presence of a storm.
Yes.
That moving groundwater does all kinds of things, backing up septic systems, pushing pipe
Would
fittings.
you believe our half hour is up?
I believe it.
I mean, this has been so interesting. You must come back again and help people. They need to know these kind of things. I didn't know that I should know how high my house is and how high my ground is, and I certainly am going to make sure that I have vegetation around now. People need to know these kinds of things because we have to get with the times.
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Appreciate it.
Holy mackerel. How do I find that out?